It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker. Chris Lowney is a former Jesuit seminarian, former managing director of J.P. Morgan and Company, and author of Heroic Leadership, Best Practices from a 450-year-old Company That Changed the World. To me, he is both leader and hero, and we are so privileged to have him with us today. Chris.
All right. Thank you, Carrie. That introduction was irresponsibly over the top. So I was invited to talk about really what's the theme right on the front page: leadership, co-responsibility for the good of the church. And the one thing I know for sure is that, in fact, everybody here has more value to add on that question than I do. So I'm going to think of myself as kind of conversation starter and hopefully spur a little imagination and discussion around that topic. And if the last session was pretty applied, I guess this is going to be a little more high-level think piece. And in order to get started, how about if I invite us to do something? What if we all take about 10 or 15 quiet seconds and think of the names of one or two living people that we would consider to be leaders? And then take a few more quiet seconds, and I wonder why you think of that name. So think of the qualities or attributes that you associate with being a good leader. Let's just take a few quiet seconds. Now, how about if I invite you to chat maybe for 30 seconds with people on either side and just share the names and ideas you come up with. You don't have to agree about anything. It's just a little thought experiment. And then in the course of my time talking, I think it'll become clear why we went through this little game. Okay, so I'll give you 30 seconds to have a chat with someone close by. Okay, let me take your attention back. Let me take your attention back. And why don't you remember the content of that discussion, and it's going to be relevant in a few more minutes. So first, here's the story that I wanted to try to work through in the course of about a half hour. One that we really imperative for us as a church is to have a very broad concept, widely distributed notion of leadership. That'll be the first idea. And then secondly, that's something that we Catholics actually ought to be great at. That theologically and spiritually there are a lot of resources, ideas, foundations we could draw on, but we aren't very good at it. That kind of came up a lot in the course of the last 45 minutes. And a big mission, a big project sometimes can help people get the sort of culture change they need to get to where they want to go. So that's going to be the story that I'm going to go through here. To get started, why don't we have a little show of hands? I want everybody to imagine the world today and the world about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, okay? If you think that the world today is faster paced, why don't you raise your hand? See, they say 100% of Catholics will never agree about anything, and now we prove. If you think the world today is more complicated than the world about 15, 20 years ago, raise your hand. 99.1%. If you think that in the course of running your life or running an organization, you have to cope with more change and make more decisions, raise your hand. Okay, look, this is why we need to talk about leadership. This is why we need to talk about leadership. When I started working at Morgan in 1983, and in 1983, when we used the word leadership, what came to our mind was a person, or maybe 3 or 4 people. Lou Preston and the corporate office at JP Morgan. Okay, that was the leadership. And then in the course of the 80s and 90s, the world became like this. And we understood that it's absolutely inconceivable. The world is too massively scaled, too complex, too fast changing, that any set of 1, 2, 4, 5 people are going to sit in a corner and make every important decision that has to be made, represent us to every important constituency we have to reach. And so we started to think about the word in a completely different way. Not so much a person and more like a behavior. Like, okay, my friend, I need you to show more leadership. Okay? And of course, every one of these issues, every one of these realities affects our Catholic Church as well, right? And so as a human organization, we have the same human imperative, human issue, that unless we get better leadership behavior, there's no way in the world we cope, okay? And in my mind, Pope Benedict really is surfacing this same kind of idea in his own ways, in his own thought process. I'll just let you read what he said here. It's the centerpiece of the description of this conference. I'll let you read the whole quote. Okay, he's not using the word leadership. He's using the word co-responsibility, co-ownership, to me, very similar kind of concept. And also, in a way, he talks about nurture the spiritual and apostolic growth. In business terms, I'd say we have to undertake a massive cultural change here, and we're not ready for it. Okay? And I want to talk a little bit about this whole idea of how we might understand leadership and how we might have good resources within our tradition to spur greater leadership. So who are leaders? People thought of great names, I'm sure, when you had your little chat there. I wonder who thought of their own name. I guess nobody or next to nobody, or probably you didn't turn to the person next to you and say me. Okay? Even though this is the leadership roundtable, by the way, right? So we're raised in a culture that teaches us to be modest people, or at least to pretend to be modest people. And especially as Christians, as Catholic Christians, humility is an incredibly important virtue. Not a week has gone by when Pope Francis doesn't talk about humility, okay? And though the humility is extremely important when it comes to the concept of leadership, I want to suggest that somehow it's misplaced, because we carry around a broken stereotype of what leadership actually is. Namely, we associate it only with being chief executive, president, general, pope, bishop, cardinal. And so our default instinct when I say think of the names of leaders is I suspect a lot of people out there thought of people who have some hierarchical authority. And that's a very important concept of leadership, but it's not the only one. Yeah? And if we're going to pull off what we're being asked to do here, one of the things we need to do is for not only ourselves, but for everybody who's sitting in the community, in any church, in any school, is that somehow, in some ways, the first people they think about as leaders are themselves. And I'll get into why that would be. And what do good leaders do to motivate people? That was the second part of that mental experiment. And I'm sure people came up with great ideas like decisiveness and honor and courage. I wonder who thought of this idea articulated by somebody with great leadership credentials. He said, you must love those you lead before you can be an effective leader. Father Boulogne is skimming his New Testament. Jesus didn't say that. In fact, who said that was Eric Shinseki, General Eric Shinseki, until a few years ago, highest ranking military officer in the United States. And the first time I heard that idea, it struck me as odd. Coming from a military class, that we all typically associate with macho, being tough. Or maybe not out of place, because the more I thought about it, the more I suspect that generals, in fact, are making better choices if they love the people they must place into difficulty. And I also bet that soldiers perform better if they believe they're valued in a very deep way by the people who have the terrible job of sending them out to face their death. So who's a leader? Okay, well, everybody's leading, well or poorly, all the time. And our first claim to leadership is not our status, rather what we do with whatever status we have. Now, this is not the way we think, but it's not a gimmick either. If you look in a dictionary, you'll see different definitions of the word leadership. They would always include this one: to point out a way, direction, or goal, and to influence others toward it. And isn't it true that everybody here is doing those words all the time, right? I mean, we're pointing out a way by virtue of how we run our schools, our parishes, our companies. We're having influence. A lot of people here are parents. Could there be any more obvious example of pointing a way and influencing others than what parents would do for children in the course of a lifetime? Yeah, and is it, to me, very interesting that in the course of the last hour, when Chuck was describing Adobe and what they were trying to do, he talked about a way, the way, right? And in fact, he very explicitly referenced, by implication, the way of Jesus, okay? So people who have it in their mind, okay, this is my first leadership opportunity and responsibility to point out the way and have influence in whatever sphere of life I have. And we tend to think about leadership as a very secular concept, a business concept almost. But in fact, this is coming to the second idea I mentioned. We could find very deep theological and spiritual basis or roots for thinking about how people lead. I might say that the first way we would all think about it might be a little paradoxical, because I guess if we went around the room and we asked people to start to identify themselves as Christians, people would use following words. I'm a follower of Jesus, right? And our religious language uses words like vocation and disciple, and the roots of those words have a following sense to them, right? Vocation, if I call you, you come to me, you're following. But our religious language also uses words like apostle and mission, right? And the roots of those words have exactly the opposite connotation. Those words mean to send. So if I send you, you're not following, you're out in front. Yeah, you're leading. So we might say we have both following and leading in a theological sense going on if we're good Christians. The 6th chapter of Isaiah, I think, is a very beautiful meditation on how we might understand this vocation to lead. Every once in a while I get asked to talk to evangelicals. Those guys will know what's in the 6th chapter of Isaiah. But I think a lot of people here are Catholic, so I will tell you what's in the 6th chapter of Isaiah. Isaiah's in the Bible. Should we start there? So the 6th chapter of Isaiah in some ways is like the prophet's experience of call. Early in the chapter, there's this, whom shall we go? Whom shall we send? Who will go for us? Something like that. And then he feels very unworthy. He says, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips. And then as the chapter goes along, he feels himself touched by God's presence. I think literally touched. If I remember, there's like angels bring a charcoal from God's throne or something. And then later in the chapter, this call comes back. Whom shall we send? Who will go for us? And then he says, here I am, send me. Okay? So I made the point that, we have theological ways in which we should be good at leadership. We can find this in our language, and also in our own spirituality we should be good at this, because if you think of some of the ideas that we know from the secular business world are important for leading well, we could find a lot of those ideas in our own spirituality as well, right? I mean, in other words, I gave the quote from the general, you must love those you lead. And I think a lot of people intuitively would go along with that. And surely we have in our spirituality the idea of love one another as I have loved you, right? And I just told this story from the prophet Isaiah, this idea that you don't kind of take it upon yourself to lead. Somehow there's calling to it. Somehow there's something authentic about it. It's not fake. It's not something I make up. And if you go into any bookstore, you're going to see at least 5 things about authentic leadership nowadays, right? Another thing deep in our spirituality, the idea of putting mission above self-interest, right? Everybody read Good to Great, right? And we remember one of the things he talks about that characterizes very high-performing companies led by level 5 leaders, right? The first secret of consulting, use arcane terminology that's not self-evident, yeah? And then he defines it. The only thing that level 5 leaders means, people who put the mission above their own self-interest, right? And surely this too would be very deep within our spirituality, right? The concept that at a certain moment, I appreciate, okay, look, it's not my world. The world doesn't revolve around me. I'm here to serve God's plan for humanity. So another very effective or very important leadership trait that happens to dovetail very nicely with Catholic spirituality. And a last one that we might not intuitively recognize so much in our own tradition, the idea of change openness, of freedom. There's a famous meditation in the spiritual exercises, right, where St. Ignatius says, okay, imagine you inherit an enormous amount of money. What ought you to do with it? And so we think, all right, St. Ignatius, give money to poor people and rejoice. And maybe that's the best thing we could do with excess money. But it's the wrong answer in the meditation, right? For any of you who've been exposed to Jesuit spirituality, I think Father Prevet has. What Ignatius says, the first thing we need to do always is make ourselves free to pursue any legitimate course of action, never an illegitimate or immoral one, but free. And only when we're free are we in a position to make a good choice, and then we choose whatever best serves our mission, okay? And it's really interesting, this idea of freedom, change, openness. This is another idea that's coming up now almost every week. Almost every week. I'll just let you read 2 quotes from the Pope. I promise you I could easily have put another 10 in there. I'll just let you read these. I won't comment on them. They go to the idea of freedom, being able to change, core leadership idea, deep in our own spirituality. I'll just let you read these. Here's another one. Okay, everybody remembers Woodrow Wilson? You want to make enemies? Try to change something, right? Great quote. Okay, so to recap our story where we are, when you have a lot of complexity and change, you need a widespread culture of leadership. And we have a lot of really good resources within our tradition that should help us to be really good at it. And I think most would intuitively agree we're not great at a very distributed notion of leadership. And a very natural question would be, well, why aren't we better? Okay. And we all have our own ideas of why we aren't better, right? I mean, look, some of them are obvious. One aspect of our church is, of course, hierarchical. We believe in the concept of a teaching authority. Many of us, certainly I, were raised in an era where Father knows best. And so we have a lot of things that kind of reinforce a sort of stereotypical boss-only model of leadership. And we really haven't worked very hard at recovering some of these other notions that might lend itself to the kind of leadership we really need, okay? And so how could we get there? You know, another reason why I want to skip that is, you know, most organizations are good at relitigating the past. And for most of my adult life, we've been relitigating the past, and nothing pleases us more as to talk about what's gone wrong and what's not going well. And it's difficult to get out of that rut. And one of the ways you can get out of that rut is, instead of focusing on the past, just say, okay, look, we have a burning platform. We have a really critical problem we have to solve. Or we have a really great opportunity. And so instead of talking about this, what I'd prefer is maybe we could change the culture and get a much more distributed sense of leadership working by focusing on some project, some task, some issue that's really urgent, that's really important, and where we could strategically define or point out a way in which everybody can play, in which everybody has some sort of leadership role. And so in the course of addressing the problem, we'll also get the culture change, the kind of behavior we want, okay? And we're going to talk about this now a little bit. And in terms of our burning platform, we could use all kinds of things. In your parish, you have really important, urgent things. In a diocese, we have important, urgent things. I'm just going to use one as a case study, the idea of a new evangelization, which Arturo kindly raised before we broke, right? And let me just let you read a paragraph from the Lineamenta, the document that introduced the 2011 Synod, where the bishops went to Rome to talk about the new evangelization. This is the very first paragraph. This is not buried in paragraph 200. This is exactly the opening. I'll let you read it. Okay. I did an unscientific survey of a handful of my friends, people who still go to church. Most could mumble something, kind of, about new evangelization, at best. What is it? What's my role? Not so much. Sense of urgency? No feeling of urgency whatsoever. The idea that this is the top of the church's agenda? Absolutely not. If we said to people, tell me what's the 3 or 4 things at the top of the agenda, no way that would have come up first, okay? So we have, to me, potentially a burning platform, something really urgent, but somehow the first step, getting shared mission that people can buy into, is not working very well, right? And let me show a couple of more slides, which might introduce different ways we could reconfigure or talk about this problem that might elicit more of a sense of urgency among folks. I'll just let you read these two. This is from a Pew Forum study. Look at the precipitousness of the drop. I mean, to me, that's really phenomenal. Forget what you think about the core number. And now here is a quote from Cardinal Hummus of Sao Paulo. I'll just let you read what he has to say. Okay, again, the precipitousness of the drop, really, really amazing, huh? Why do I pick those two countries, those two slides? First, most importantly, I'm lazy and I easily found them. Second reason, of course, this is 20% of global Catholicism, more or less, right? And it's not, it's not like the other 80% of the stories are absolutely fabulous. There are a lot of very, very problematic stories out there. So we could, and I know people at every point on the Catholic ideological spectrum, and no matter what people happen to think, I don't know anybody who feels happy about that. It's the kind of thing that can appeal to people, whatever their brand of or tribe of being Catholic happens to be. So if we could kind of get some sense of mission and then articulate some sense of strategy that might make people feel, okay, look, each of us has an opportunity and a need to contribute. What might that look like? And this is not a strategy. I'm just trying to tee up a case study for the purpose of discussion, right? So among the elements of a strategy, you might say, okay, look, what if we said we need to be more welcoming? We need to be more accountable to the people who come to us. We need to be more entrepreneurial in the way we approach them. And why these 3 pieces let's go through each of those. Let's start with the idea of being more welcoming. Answer? Someone invited him. Now, let me confess that I have never invited anybody to come to church. And I won't embarrass us by saying, let's show of hands who has, huh? And the next part is not my embarrassment, but our church's embarrassment. I've attended a lot of churches. Nobody has ever asked me to invite somebody to come to church. So in terms of a kind of a culture of welcome, we're pretty far behind the pack, I would say here, insofar as this is any kind of indicator. And we could easily imagine how being more welcoming is the sort of thing that would call on talents from the individual family on up to a diocese and the church at large. Huh? And of course, once you welcome people, you have to have some accountability for what their human experience and spiritual growth is like when we got there. And that's the sense in which I want to talk about accountability. Accountability for the spiritual growth of those that come. And let's think about those a little bit. Here is another statistic from Pew Forum. Those who've left outnumber those who've joined by 4 to 1. We're not very welcoming, and we have a lot going in the other direction. And look at when they ask people, these are Catholics who've gone to a Protestant church, what are the reasons why you left? Okay? You're not going to be able to read this, and you don't need to go through the whole thing. I just want to point out the top 3, which to me are really interesting and revealing, and at the same moment, incredibly frustrating and incredibly hopeful. Top 3, spiritual needs not being met, 71%. Found a religion they like more, 70%. Just gradually drifted away, over 50%. Hopeful and frustrating because to me these are very controllable, or among the most controllable things. Dogmatic issues, I might not be able to change to suit you. But what kind of human experience, what kind of spiritual growth you have when you come to us, that's something I should be able to be accountable for. And of course, the first step in doing something like about this is actually understanding what people's experience is. Some of you who are in the field know about the Reveal survey, which I think Willow Church pioneered and is now being done in about 200 churches. And they asked people, well, what do you want most from church? Here is what people who took the survey happened to say. And then they asked people every year to report on their spiritual growth or how well their experience at church lines up against these needs. My point is this idea of trying to be accountable to the spiritual growth of those who come. And in the unfortunate case that people eventually decide to leave, maybe another logical piece of accountability would be, well, why don't we go out and check how they're doing, see if they come back. And let's look at another interesting bit of data. This, I think, is a Hartford Seminary survey. It's too busy and complicated, so you don't try to read all of it. Let me just point out what, to me, are the most revealing aspects. Percent of congregations who definitely contact lapsed attendees. People stop coming, we contact them, okay? Protestant churches, other than the old line Protestants, look at that. And who is down here at the bottom of the pile? We are, huh? And another interesting piece just within the Catholic bar of churches that are Catholic churches that are declining, only about 23% contact people who've lapsed. Of Catholic churches that are growing, more than a third are contacting people who have left. Okay, so in terms of, again, our idea is we're trying to imagine a case study where we could invite leadership throughout our whole community. And one is, gee, could we build a strategy for being more welcoming? Could we build a strategy for being more accountable to those who come to us? And those who are sociologists in the room or who are, like Father Rees, are involved in university education, of course, are thinking, okay, this is incredibly simplistic what the guy is doing, because any one number masks an incredibly diverse reality. And that comes to really my third point, namely to be much more entrepreneurial in how we approach people, right? Because of those who don't come in the first place or those who leave. Some of them are spiritual but not religious, in their 20s. Maybe they believe in God. They think the Catholic Church is too rigid. They don't like churches being so involved in politics. And that big number also includes, here are some Brazilian Pentecostals, and what they like is somebody who's praying with them in their own language, maybe very urban, very poor community. And that number also includes people who are going to suburban mega churches, upper middle class families, and kind of like the feel of a shopping mall that a mega church gives them. And this big number also includes, all those Europeans who they're not so sure about the whole thing anyway, and they don't really want to hear very much. And there's going to be no one-size-fits-all way of addressing this incredibly diverse array of people. So in terms of our strategy of inviting people to our church, clearly another aspect is going to be we're going to have to do some real narrowcasting. In other words, be much more entrepreneurial into what community is this guy in and how might I reach him, and what is this guy like and how might we reach him, and that's going to call on lots of different mini strategies in entrepreneurialism. Okay, last idea, and then I'm going to shut up and invite you to chat with each other a bit. I want to explain the background to this quote and how it's relevant. So once I had the privilege to visit Quantico, where the top-level Marine officer candidates are vetted, yeah? And if you haven't been there, you've certainly seen on television or in a movie what these guys go through. These are guys that are waking up in the middle of the night and putting 100-pound packs on them and sending them out without compasses to march in the rain and this kind of stuff. And at a certain moment, I asked the colonel, so look, obviously you're trying to weed out who is not tough enough and who is tough. Other than that, what skills are you trying to give these people? And the guy says to me, the only thing I'm trying to do, I'm trying to get these people comfortable with the reality of being uncomfortable. And he said that, and I say, okay, now I have my metaphor for the 21st century. Because he, of course, meant it literally. That we're going to be dropping people into battle zones. People are going to be shooting bullets at them. And every human instinct in that environment is bad. I'm going to be paralyzed, unable to make any decision. I'm going to run away. I'm going to make the first decision that comes to my mind. And in a way, what he's trying to convey is, okay, look, I understand you're uncomfortable. But somehow we need you to keep operating in the face of discomfort, to be able to make decisions, to make choices, to keep going forward and not just pull your head down into the trench and wait until it passes over. And to me, this is where we are as a church. It's very uncomfortable. I don't know anybody who's entirely happy and at ease with the human, cultural, technological, social environments in which we find ourselves. But this is our challenge, to accept the fact that it's uncomfortable and to keep operating and keep being creative and keep thinking and keep moving forward. So that's my final word, and thanks everybody very much for paying so much attention. Okay, now we have some time. If this is okay with Kerry, what I would suggest is, what if we just took 3, 4, 5 minutes, and what if folks had some little chat nearby, and you can talk about whatever you want. But my suggestion would be, my suggestion would be, what if you spoke about some idea that really struck you? Struck you doesn't necessarily mean I was right, but the whole idea was to spur thought and creativity. So struck me could be, that's a really important issue. He was 100% wrong about it, but it's really important. Or I don't know what. This issue came up and I learned something from that. It's really relevant. We need to do something different. We need to think about that. So what if we just leave 3 or 4 or 5 minutes for that kind of back and forth, and then we'll have some time for open session from the floor. Is that okay? All right. Okay, let's pull ourselves together. Um, and all comments most welcome. All questions most welcome. I think Jim's image is a nice one. Community of practice. People might have interesting ideas that they want to share. And let me just ask one thing at Carrie's request, that when people, before you make your comment, please just give your name and what organization you're with, just so folks get to know each other better. John.
Tom Healy. I'm treasurer of the Roundtable. And Chris, you and I gave you a little bit of advance warning last night. But relate this to the new Pope. We're all discovering and all, I think, very hopeful of his new attitude. But on your themes of both welcoming and accountability, how does he fit on that, and how do we learn from what he's trying to instruct us?
Okay, so I'll make a couple of comments about that, but of course I'm going to leave 99.5% of that to Father Reese, who's the expert, tomorrow morning. So let me tell you this anecdote, which a couple of you may have read. One, I think it's been reported, but one of the guys who was one of the seminarians with him told me this. A Jesuit who was in the seminary when he was rector of the seminary. So at a certain point, they asked him, while he was rector of the Jesuit seminary, to start a new parish around that neighborhood. Okay, and he asked for volunteers to help him among the seminarians, and of course they all did. They're working for him, and so he divided the whole thing in zones. He just divided it all up in a grid, and he said, "Okay, go out and meet people. Go everywhere. Make sure you go to the poorest. Don't comb the sheep," was the image he used. I guess we would say skim the cream. Go to everybody. And so that one. And then now years later, this has been reported. I'm sure you saw this when he was cardinal in Buenos Aires. There was some study was done where some sociologist or somebody said that the real sphere of influence in a church is about 600 meters in every direction for a church or something like that. So he says, okay, our physical parishes are often larger than that, so why don't we set up little storefronts and get catechists or somebody to man them and to person them and to receive those who might show up. And one of the priests says to him, but if people start going to that place, they might not come to the church. And the cardinal says, well, are they coming to church now? And he says, no. He says, okay. So, this kind of concept of, of course, everybody, you read into people what you want to read in, right? But to me, this idea of, okay, look, we have to get out into the game. And you have to take some risk, and you have to try things. These quotes about being free, okay? Now, the real challenge for any leader in any organization is, what can you change? What can you not change? What should you change and shouldn't? And of course, those questions in religious organizations are incredibly loaded, right? Because when I worked at Morgan, so we had core values that we said were inviolable, but we all knew that, okay, at the end of the day, a bunch of guys with flip charts made up our core values, and we're going to change them every half dozen years. Whereas in a religious setting, you believe your core values were revealed. They're not negotiable. And so that always makes it incredibly difficult in terms of what can we change and not change. And of course, that's going to be a challenge. So those are thoughts that come to my mind. Please. Mary.
Hold on. Thank you.
The word welcoming was a real call to Mary A.G., and I'm struck by kind of the conscience call by the word welcoming. I found myself asking, why haven't I invited a friend or someone to come with me? And what was coming up was a real sense of almost embarrassment. We don't invite somebody to something that we're not sure is going to be a positive experience for them. Mm-hmm. And I think what's really the elephant in the room is there's just such a breach of trust that many of us have become quite private in our worship. And if anything, have distanced ourselves. So the concept of welcoming was a great word because it brought up for me, the very essence of what is wrong right now for many of us in the church. I don't want to look back and be critical. I love what's going on here where we're coming up with solutions and platforms on fire. That's great. But I think when it really gets down to it, there's a lot of broken hearts in this room.
Yeah, okay, nice comment. And I just make this bit a comment. No, so one, I skipped this slide, but really interesting to see how evangelicals interpret their role, right? This was a survey of global evangelical pastors a couple of years ago. What's essential to being a good evangelical? Number 2, working to lead others to Christ. And I think we'd probably say that, but in a rather more diffuse way. The concept that part of my role is actually to bring somebody to the community, at least that's not what I feel. And many of my feelings would be the same as yours. So exactly some of the reasons that you spoke about, I would share. But here's what I would also say to myself, that one of the ways you become more accountable to yourself, I don't mean you personally, but as a community, as if we say, okay, look, now I invited the guy and it wasn't a positive experience. So we have to, it kind of forces us now to have an encounter with each other that might be uncomfortable, So I think you raise a really good, important issue, But maybe putting our foot into it, literally putting our foot into it, also forces us to be accountable to ourselves and the broader community, and and so on. So it's a nice point and question. Please.
That accountability is really tied. Lori Myrick, Menlo Park, St. Raymond's. That accountability is really tied to openness and transparency, which is a word I like to use in the corporate environment. And I was glad to see openness as one of your 4 aspects of spiritual leadership, because I think one of the things that we really need to start to do to regain the trust that everybody's talking about is to be as transparent as possible. And that's everything from finances to mission statements to policies to what have you. Because I think a large part, at least in our parish, of why people haven't been giving is because they just don't have any confidence that there's a strategy and a plan in place that people can get behind and will build the kind of church that you want to invite your friends to.
Yeah.
So I think that, corporations, because of governmental compliance and regulations, have been forced to be more transparent. But we have a long ways to go, and we need to look to some of those best practices, I think.
Okay, thank you. Very nice. And could I pick up just one tiny piece of transparency and openness, not the main thing you went to? Remember I put up this slide and kind of made the comment that people actually don't get it, that there's some what it is and that there's some urgency and so on. And one person's opinion. Sometimes it strikes me that we are careful to communicate things in a sort of a paternalistic way. Don't worry, it's okay, it's kind of under control. And part of my corporate experience was the bosses who get the best results were the guys who sat down and said, you know something? We have a huge problem, and I can't fix it alone, and I think I have some ideas, but I don't have the plan, and we're going to have to figure out how to do it. And personal interpretation, that's part of some of what's going on here, that people don't perceive, the unvarnished reality of some of what we all have to cope with is not coming across in a way that evokes their sense of mission and desire to kind of help and save something that they love. Steve.
Steve Forbett from University of San Francisco. In practice, the new evangelization looks a lot like the old evangelization. And I think that this whole idea of welcoming, it's less about inviting people to church and more about engaging people where they are. And it's not starting with the gospel, but starting with, like the Vatican did, the hopes and fears, the anxiety, the kind of the fundamental human experiences, and people feeling comfortable doing that. And so it's a way of being church that you're not in a perpetual argument with the culture. You're in a conversation and you're looking for better understanding. You're not trying to win. And I think that colors, and I think this Pope kind of captures that. I think what's really important to him is what he's not saying. And that's why people are listening, because he's got some credibility, because he's not hammering the same old stuff. So I think there is a freshness that is quite hopeful.
Thanks. Please.
Tony Kutcher, National Federation of Priest Councils. To dovetail on what he said, he kind of took some of my words, but one of the things that we, I guess, have supposed is this invitation is to a worship service. And in fact, at the parish level, that is quite often not the best place to bring somebody new, because one or more of the facets of worship is done not optimally, I'll say. How's that? But to begin with, something that we do. An example, don't invite them to church, invite them to go with you to the soup kitchen. Invite them to come to an RCIA session that you know the presenter is going to be very good, so that they don't see the priest in his vestments, but they see other people just like them doing mission. And then the question comes, what is propelling these people to do this? Now I'm curious. Now take me to worship.
Okay, that's a beautiful comment. And can I just pick up on the first part of that and tell you that I'll make an analogy and then come to directly what you said. So I remember when we first started doing diversity training, you know? We still haven't gotten the joke, but anyway, when we first started, not in the church, in financial services. And at one time we had a great consultant. One of their big concepts was, they said, you know, the first thing you need to do is move from unconscious bias to conscious bias. And that's not exactly the same point, but what you said never actually crossed my mind. When I said be more inviting, be more welcoming, my default mechanism is Sunday Mass. And that was really interesting to me. So I think it sort of just raises this broader issue of, you know, we all have kind of default assumptions of how we ought to do things or what's normative or how to approach things. And sometimes, you know, we just maybe, you need to step back and say, well, wait a minute, you know? So that was a really valuable comment for me personally. It kind of brings me up against some of my own assumptions that would not be helpful in terms of the strategic place we want to go. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments there. I really enjoyed it. It's very stimulating. Can I ask Jim O'Keefe from the north of England? You can't operate one of these things very efficiently. Can I ask you just to reflect on the word loyalty? Because I think there are circumstances in which loyalty and tyranny are not that different. And to whom or to what would one want to be loyal?
Uh-huh.
And how does that fit? I mean, you only got 25 hours to answer this question, really. But how does that fit in with the last comment? The Newman stuff about to change is to live is to change, and to change often is to be perfect, and kind of thing. I mean, but loyalty is a scary, scary word. I would like to be disloyal more often, I think, to certain things.
Yeah. Well, sorry, hold on to that for a second. Would you just say another sentence about loyalty? Loyalty in a way I used it, or you're just raising a new...
I think in the way you used it. I mean, I'm thinking of Nuremberg. People were loyal,
yeah,
but it was not like a good model.
Yeah. Did I say love? Did I say love and loyalty?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
so
you put in. You had this Latin phrase actually, which really impressed us.
I think you raised a good point, but in fact, when I put that up, the only point I was making is that one of the, I wasn't making the idea, I wasn't raising the idea so much as I'm going to be loyal to the institution at all costs, but rather one of the things that might or might not be a good thing to do, yeah? But one of the things that we know about people who are leading teams well is that they exercise some care for those they have. They're loyal to their own team. They're not using their own team. They're not willing to abandon their team, this kind of sense. So I actually, in this slide, raised it in, I think, a somewhat different sense than you had raised. Please. Father John.
John Hurley, Pauliston, Archdiocese of Baltimore. I think when I was looking at your columns of the Protestants and those that are reaching out, I think one of the things that I see as good news for us, even though they may be with a different ecclesial group right now, is the majority of Catholics that make up a vast number of people in megachurches have a hunger, and we're not feeding. And I think that, to me, is if we can feed more effectively, I think there's what goes around can come around, so to speak. But I think the other piece, to me, when we look at leadership is, and I was sharing this with my group here, that we have to remember that discipleship is at the root of it. And that's where the passion and the love and that loyalty that you're speaking about, I think, comes to fruition there. That if we have the passion to do this, otherwise we become a tactician in this. Leadership becomes a function.
Yeah.
I think we have a lot of that in the church right now. I don't think priests and bishops see themselves as disciples unless the question's raised. I think we see ourselves in the tasks we're doing rather than that overall umbrella fact of that we're disciples. And I think when we start using that language more in connection with leadership, I think then something tremendous can happen. Yeah. And I think we'll begin to see, because the mega churches are vastly made up of our own people. And that's good news, because there's a lot of potential that if we get our act together and start feeding people with what they need to be fed with, rather than what we think they need to be fed with, I think there's tremendous potential and viability there.
Right. Okay, beautiful. I have nothing to add to that, except let me pick up and affirm, you kind of make this, you implicitly made a decision between discipleship and sheer tacticalness, right? And to me, sheer tacticalness is, let's just get bums in seats, right? And you're talking about something rather much deeper than that, and I was too, I hope, yeah. But not very nice, very well put, yeah. Please, Bishop.
Stephen Blair, Bishop of Stockton. One of the issues I think that we face today in terms of leadership is the reality is where people experience church is in the parish. But the number of priests who are truly, what I want to say, capable of being leaders in the parishes are fewer. We have a lot of priests, and many of them are very good priests, but they're not all capable of being pastors of the parishes. And our hands are a bit tied, though we are moving more into training lay people to be parish life coordinators, where priests do come in and serve as priests in that situation. But I find the great challenge is in the parishes where you would like much of what has been talked about here to happen, but the priest who's the pastor does not understand it or embrace it, or is even capable, maybe. And we have tried. I've sent all of our priests to good leaders, good shepherds, and you see some who have blossomed through it, and others, it's just another program that they went through. So that is, I think that's part of the problem, where the person talked about, well, I invite somebody and I don't have much there to offer. Well, it's because a lot of times there's not the initiative or the imagination that is taken. So it's a big challenge with fewer clergy.
Yeah. Okay. Could I? That's another great comment, and maybe I could make a very bad analogy to pick up on one piece of it. So I remember during my time we used to have, especially as the business of banking and investment banking started changing a lot. You had a set of people who really did not have the product skills to kind of understand what they had to try to do and sell. Some of them were wonderful, well-trusted, advisors and had good relationships. And two kinds of things happened. You know, you had one sort of person who said, you know, I understand what I can't do well, and they tried to surround themselves with those who could complement their weaknesses, and those guys did incredibly well, you know? I mean, they could get the meeting with the company, and they were very well trusted, and their word was important, and they could bring somebody who says, okay, I'm going to tell you about the rocket science. And then we had other people who just found that an incredible assault on their dignity, you know, and would refuse to kind of acknowledge the skills they didn't have and look for complementarity. And what you said is richer than that, but it seems to me there's, you know, maybe some analogy there as well. You know, do we have somebody who understands and kind of reaches out for the complementarity that lets others show their leadership and lets the whole group succeed? That's different from those who refuse to invite others. Okay, I guess one more comment or question. Bob, please.
Thanks for your comment, Bob Beloin, St. Thomas More Chapel at Yale. I'm wondering if a business lost 1% of its customer base every year for 40 years, and they would say, we have to do it differently. And what keeps us from saying the choice is either keep doing what we're doing, only work harder at it, or do something different? What gets in the way of us seeing that something fundamental has to change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the $64 question, and I invite others to answer that, because I don't have a great answer, except to say, you know, I mean, culture change is always really, really hard, you know? And to me, everything is more loaded when you're in a revealed religion, you know? You don't feel exactly the same freedom. And finally, you know, often when you're losing 1% of your 1% of your customer base every year, you are sitting on a burning platform. You know, there's nobody who has any doubt that business as usual is acceptable, you know, because we're gone. And I don't think we feel, you know, we're in a very different context, and I don't think we feel a burning platform, you know, so it doesn't come across with the same feeling of urgency. We need to do something, either positively speaking because of the depth of our discipleship and we have something good and true to offer, and how could we stand by and not offer it to more people, or from the negative sense of, look, how can we just sit here and watch ourselves be cannibalized? Okay, I think I've overstayed my welcome, and thanks for the time.
Chris, thank you so much for leading us in this dynamic discussion. In fact, many of the observations that emerged from this session are at the heart of why the Leadership Roundtable on Church Management was created in the first place. So there is hope on the horizon. I neglected when I introduced this morning's panelists and Chris earlier to draw your attention to the biographies in your packet, your conference packet, where you will see much more detail of all of the speakers here.